Hello, everyone. DMFF here once again. And now that the leaves have mostly fallen and the weather is getting colder and snow may be just around the corner, I figured I would delve into another story. This time, it is actually related to the last storytime video that I was talking to you all about. But instead of the focus being on the book, I wanted this to be a focus of my history with the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the impact that it has had on my life throughout the years from 2002 until now. Sometime in May of 2002, my family, along with my cousin and his family, went camping in a place pretty close to the Canadian border. This was a fairly long car trip, but luckily, I had plenty of batteries, my Game Boy Color, and Pokemon Crystal to keep me company. I was busy fighting the Elite Four over and over and over again to maximize the stat experience on my team, so then that way I could battle this new team against my friends at school when I got back home from this vacation. I'm pretty sure I actually completed the stat experience gain on all of my Pokemon for that party in that car ride, and was done with about a half hour to spare, but that's neither here nor there. When we arrived, our parents set up our campers, and then we all went out to lunch at a local burger joint. Don't remember the name of it, but it was pretty good. Afterwards, our parents decided that we were all going to go shopping at the local mall in that area. We ended up eventually going into a toy store. I think it might have been a KB Toys or something like that. But my cousin and I, who had just recently begun watching the Yu-Gi-Oh anime as it was airing on TV, saw that there were Yu-Gi-Oh cards for sale. And we both asked our parents if we could get some. We both asked to have one of each starter deck and maybe a pack of cards, in which they actually did. Both my cousin and I got a copy of Starter Deck Yugi and a Starter Deck Kaiba. Additionally, we each received one pack of The Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. My cousin pulled a Maneater bug out of his pack, which was actually a pretty big deal at the time, and I pulled Gaia the Dragon Champion from my pack. That secret rare foiling just immediately got me hooked and made me start my journey in playing Yu-Gi-Oh! While I could not use my card competitively, it was basically my first piece of my collection. I also didn't realize this at the time, but my copy was actually a misprinted copy. The letters on my Gaia the Dragon Champion were actually golden instead of that rainbowy foil that you would get in a normal secret rare. Of course, these booster packs were unlimited and not first edition, as this was May, but that is a card that means an awful lot to me and is still in my collection to this day. Here it is if you haven't seen it before. I have posted it in one of my shorts on the channel, but here it is for you to take a look at. One of my favorite cards in my collection. My cousin and I figured out the rules and ended up dueling with customized versions of the two starter decks combined. It was a lot of fun, and definitely set forth our interest in the game for years to come. The rest of the vacation, however, we didn't really do a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Dueling. We did maybe one other time, but the majority of this camping trip, we were riding our bikes and fishing and doing all the fun camp things that you do. I remember one of the days that we were there, my cousin and I rode bikes all day from the beginning of the day until the end of the day. I remember we actually used some playing cards, not our Yu-Gi-Oh cards, used some playing cards to put in our spokes so then we sounded more like dirt bikes. I know it's stupid, but we rode from morning until night. And we didn't stop and eat anything. We did have water on us and stuff, but we didn't eat. Then, when we were finally all tuckered out, our parents had ordered like 4 pan pizzas from Pizza Hut, and somehow they allowed us to each have our own pizza. My cousin and I each completely destroyed that entire pizza to our faces. But I'm getting off track and I digress. Getting back to school, I had discovered that my friends had also gotten Yu-Gi-Oh cards as they said they were wanting to do. So we all had our own decks, and that's where we started playing. Most of 2002 was not spent playing the game of Yu-Gi-Oh competitively. I remember one of my friends had his entire collection of cards as his deck, which was like 200 cards. Shortly thereafter, summer vacation was upon us. And with summer vacation meant more time for us friends to hang out and more duels to be had. And it also meant that a new drop was about to happen. A new set was about to come out and completely change the game from what we knew it was. And that set was Metal Raiders. Metal Raiders released a ton of great cards, alongside a ton of, kind of poopy cards as well. But cards like Sangan, Witch of the Black Forest, Magician of Faith, Dark Elf, Seven-Colored Fish, Jiraiya, Magic Jammer, Seven Tools, Solemn Judgment, Horn of Heaven, Mirror Force, ultra-rare printings of Summon Skull, and Change of Heart. Not to mention pieces for some new decks, such as Clown Control or Hand Control. With these new ways to play the game, it started to shape the way that we would play the game as well. Though initially, that friend with the 200 card deck just got a larger deck, we each ended up pulling something worthwhile in this set, or even multiple somethings. That friend with the 200 card deck ended up pulling Solemn Judgment and Heavy Storm. And while at first we did think that Solemn Judgment was too steep of a cost, whenever it went off to negate a summon, spell, or trap card, it completely could shape the game in his favor and turn it around and win. Seeing plays like this made us eventually realize that we need to have a cohesive strategy with cards to be able to protect our strategy and shape the game in our favor. But as we learned more and more about strategy within that year of 2002, we learned to cut the fat in our decks and actually create some kind of cohesive strategy. September 1st was the official release date of Tournament Pack 1, and we just so happened to have a local scene called Three Guys Games and Paintball, your one-stop shop for all things video games, card games, or paintball. I loved that store. It's no longer in business now, but this is about the time that my friends and I start going to these local tournaments to try to get some awesome cards out of the deal. It was at this point that my deck was quite basic, and it was my own rendition of the Dragon Rush strategy, supplemented with Witch of the Black Forest, Sangan, and the big beaters of the time, such as La Jin, the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, Dark Elf, and Jiraiya. Unbeknownst to me, however, my deck would actually see a surge in power within the coming weeks, as Magic Ruler was about to drop. Now, you might be asking yourself, what could possibly have dropped in Magic Ruler that would have powered up your deck? It just so happens that it is basically the same cards that powered up every other deck: Mystic Tomato and Acts of Despair. As the new format progressed, I began to believe that these cards were truly necessary to actually perform within this meta. I don't quite remember his name, but someone at our local scene ended up getting their hands on 3 copies of Mechanical Chaser, and it defined the format. This change in the meta caused me to drop all of my copies of Lajin Mystical Genie of the Lamp and replace them with Mahavelo and the suite of Acts of Despairs and even some Malevolent Nuzzlers just to be able to get the strategy off more frequently. I had also dropped the one Jirai Gumo that I was running and decided to run 3 copies of Dark Elf to help combat this mechanical chaser money wall meta. It worked to an extent, but I soon found that the deck's greatest weakness was, in fact, now Mystical Space Typhoon. I was also starting to find flaws in the overall Dragon Rush strategy and toyed around with dropping the strategy altogether. And at the beginning of October, I did just that. Because at the beginning of October, Tournament Pack 2 released. And with that release came Morphing Jar, which that one person that had the 3 copies of Mechanical Chaser was actually able to get 2 copies of Morphing Jar, and he ran both of them. This, for me, put the nail in the coffin for Dragon Rush, as many times my combo pieces would end up getting discarded due to this Morphing Jar conundrum. Ultimately, after the tournament of the first weekend of October, I dropped the Dragon Rush strategy and switched to a beatdown strategy featuring Mahavelo and 2 copies of Summon Skull, as well as a suite of equip cards. In a few short weeks, however, would be the release of Pharaoh's Servant, which would give us some very powerful tools for the rest of the year going forward. I dropped a Summon Skull for a Jinzo when I eventually pulled one in November, but the addition of Premature Burial was now one of the best ways to be special summoning Mahavelo from our graveyard, as it would then come back with 2050 attack, and this would be my deck list going forward for the rest of the year, and even the beginning of the year of 2003, as the next set to release would actually be 2 sets at the same time, Tournament Pack 3 and Labyrinth of Nightmare, on March 1st of 2003. While I did end up placing in the tournament of the first weekend of March 2003, and my tournament pack prizing did include a copy of a super rare Mechanical Chaser, I honestly had no idea that Mechanical Chaser had already been power crept through Labyrinth of Nightmare, as that weekend nobody even had a copy of Gemini Elf yet. The store that we were at had a few copies, but no one purchased them that day. As the month progressed, however, more players started getting their hands on a copy, 2 or 3, of Gemini Elf. Additionally, the young man that had the ultra-rare copies of Mechanical Chaser and Morphing Jar ended up getting 3 copies of Needleworm, and ended up bringing a deck that I like to call a precursor to Empty Jar to the tournament, and it actually performed fairly well as a competent mill deck. It was at this time, through pulls and trading, that I ended up with 1 copy of Gemini Elf, 1 copy of Bazoo the Soul Eater, and a copy each of United We Stand and Mage Power. The monsters replaced 2 copies of Dark Elf, 1 copy of Dark Elf still remaining, and my copies of Malevolent Nuzzler were dropped in favor of Mage Power and United We Stand. Shortly thereafter, starter decks Joey and Pegasus dropped on March 30th, and Stairway to the Destined Duel promos dropped a little bit later on April 8th. Starter Deck Joey and Starter Deck Pegasus gave us Scapegoat and Graceful Charity, respectively, and Worldwide Edition ended up giving us Harpy's Feather Duster and Sinister Serpent, and I ended up running all of these aforementioned cards at a copy each. It was also around this time that I had noticed some of the regular faces at our local tournament were starting to run their own versions of Mahavelo Beatdown. Because of this, Mahavelo Beatdown became the best deck of our format, with myself or other friendly faces winning the tournaments with a Maha Velo deck list. This would continue until the beginning of June, with the set Legacy of Darkness dropping on June 6th, 2003. This set released a bunch of support for dragons, warriors, and fiends, which each of my friends that went to these tournaments actually took their deck lists in a different direction of those three directions I just mentioned. Spirit monsters were also introduced in this set, but most of them were completely overlooked except for one, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Also, my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh card of all time was printed in this set, and that is Injection Fairy Lily, who immediately went into my deck as she was easy to search with Sangan or Witch, and could get over just about anything, and functioned quite well with equip cards as well. Oh, can't get over her anymore because her attack is higher than 400. But it was the cards drop-off and Yata Garasu that really made a difference in this format and made the format a divide between various themed beatdown decks such as Fiends, Warriors, Dragons, or even still the Maha Vilo strategy, and now Hand Control. Players were utilizing strong equip cards such as Axe of Despair and Mage Power and United We Stand to buff Magical Hat to be able to beat over monsters and rip cards from the hand, alongside the 3 discard cards, Confiscation, Forceful Sentry, and Delinquent Duo, but now including Drop-Off and Yata Garasu in these lists, pushed the deck to be a contender and proved to be a top-tier deck, winning almost every tournament within the month of June. Air Knight Parshath was also a notable card that just about every single deck was running, as it was a way for you to be able to pierce and gain more resources upon doing damage, which is basically the opposite of like a white magical hat. The game was clearly becoming more control-focused, and I toyed with an idea that was basically a hybrid between the Maha Velo strategy and the hand control strategy, utilizing some Shining Angels to be able to get to my white magical hats more consistently, as this was a more aggressive version of the hand control deck, and I also did not have a copy of Yata Garasu. This was more of a tempo deck that looked to out-tempo our opponents and win with damage throughout the turns while controlling what our opponents play. I did want a Yata Garasu to be able to pull off that infamous Yata lock that has been done to me. I was unable to pull one, and seeing as it was a $60 card at the time, I didn't have the funds to buy it. As a surprise for doing well in school, my mom actually gifted me a copy of Yata Garasu and a couple of other staples that I had needed for this deck idea, as well as the new box of Pharaonic Guardian on July 18th. She was specifically waiting for this set to come out, so then that way I could have a box of the brand new set. And that's when everything came together, with Spirit Reaper and Don Zalug now printed into the game. I ended up with 2 copies of Don Zalug from that box and 2 copies of Spirit Reaper from that box, as well as a single copy of Ring of Destruction, which made and broke games. I coupled this with another super rare card that I had pulled, Barrel Behind the Door. The way this used to work before Ring of Destruction was errated is you would be able to respond to Barrel Behind the Door to negate the damage that you would take and make your opponent take both your damage that you would take and the damage that they would take from Ring of Destruction. While I do admit this combo can be a bit inconsistent at times, it can also be utilized against your opponent's Ring of Destruction. This combo snuck me so many sneaky wins, and even taking entire tournaments due to this. I became well known at the local scene as the guy with the ring barrel combo, which was very flattering at the time, and also caused a surge of players running barrel behind the door in their own decks. The ruling at that time actually allowed you to barrel behind the door the damage that they're barreling at you, and it was such a funky ruling time period that there was many ring barrel battles that occurred at these tournaments. I believe the ruling was actually incorrect, and you could not barrel behind the door someone else's barrel behind the door, which did get rectified in a following tournament, which caused most players to remove their barrel behind the door. But I still ended up running one barrel behind the door, as you could chain it to either your or your opponent's Ring of Destruction, as long as it is the very next card played after Ring of Destruction. As such, I still kept my title as Ring Barrel Guy. It was also at this time that everybody in the scene switched over to Donsalug and Spirit Reaper as well, and the format became mostly dominated by hand control decks, with some iterations of Beatdown still bebopping around, and my hybrid Beatdown hand control tempo deck. My deck performed well, often topping events and sometimes winning events, but I often find myself losing to pure hand control lists. I found myself struggling with consistency issues due to the equip cards in my deck. Over the coming months, I decided to drop the Maha Vilo strat, but keeping the more powerful Mage Power and United We Stand in the deck, and opted for more readily useful monsters such as Zombira the Dark, Gemini Elf, Injection Fairy Lily, and Bazu the Soul Eater, which started to see more success than my previous hybrid build. Though I would end up finding my true answer as to how I would take this deck forward in the month of October. On October 10th, 2003, Magician's Force released, and had me considering going back to a Dragon Rush build, as now there was a 1900 attack dragon monster that could be cheated out with Flute of Summoning Dragon, or just normal summoned as a perfectly good normal summon. But I ultimately scrapped that idea and went with something else entirely. A package of Skilled Dark Magician and a copy of Dark Magician to be able to summon straight from the deck. Dark Magician hand tempo had begun to take shape, and people did not believe in it whatsoever. But I did. I had the heart of the cards for this deck, and it ended up becoming my highest win rate deck to this point. That small Dark Magician engine ended up adding just enough power and resilience to be able to perform well in the mirror match against other hand control decks. It did, however, have its flaws, as seeing the Dark Magician in your hand at any time was terrible and something that you never wanted to see. For me, Dark Magician was like my first Garnet or Brick in the deck, which people may be very familiar with Dark Magician as a brick in the deck from running Verte and Dragoon when that was available to be run. But I digress. For this reason, everyone at the tournament decided not to run a deck with this little engine in it besides myself. Games where Dark Magician stuck to the field were usually ended in victories when played correctly. So I stuck to my guns and continued to run Dark Magician hand tempo for the rest of the year, including on December 1st, Dark Crisis released, which honestly didn't do much for my deck at all. It did add additional power to one of my friend's Fiend decks with his very own 1900 attack monster, and in my opinion, might be the best 1900 attack generic monster that you can get. as it has exactly 1,500 defense points, can be searched by Witch, and is the highest defense points that can be searched by Witch. Plus, he did include some of the Archfiends in his deck, so it was like an Archfiend, evil Bakura deck, and it was actually pretty cool. Dark Necrofear being his main boss monster and ways to steal your opponent's monsters was pretty clutch. He was the only person at this tournament scene that would run such a deck, and it did perform middlingly, but it was still an interesting deck, and it did top some of the time. The status quo would remain the same for the rest of the year throughout December and the beginning of the year in 2004, until March 1st, 2004, which saw Starter Deck Yugi Evolution and Starter Deck Kaiba Evolution, which had no bearing on this meta really whatsoever. But I do like the Blackluster Soldier included in it. I love that Blackluster Soldier so much that I have two minty pristine copies, one that's going to be in a card frame and the other one's in my binder, and two damaged copies, which are basically my key card for getting me indoors at work. Obviously, the two damaged cards sandwiching the key card in the middle, but I digress. This isn't about that. Instead, the set that changed everything, Invasion of Chaos, dropped on this day as well. And somehow my stepdad was able to get a really incredible deal on boxes of this set, and I ended up with like 2 or 3 boxes of this set around the time that it released. Of course, I opened the boxes, and between what I had gotten, I ended up pulling a copy each of Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End, and Dark Magician of Chaos, all of which immediately went into my deck. I remember lamenting how I wished I pulled more than one of each of Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon, but it turns out that they ended up both getting limited to one shortly thereafter, so it wasn't too much of a loss for me. This is where Dark Magician Chaos Hand Tempo came into play, and could easily pull off the Chaos Emperor Dragon into Yatagarasu Yatalock combo. When I brought this deck to the very first tournament of that weekend, it absolutely decimated the entirety of the scene, as everyone had thought that Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon were terrible, because you couldn't search them, they're basically bricks in your hand if you don't have the stuff in your deck. But they forgot that we have, like, Graceful Charity and Raigeki Break and Hard Destruction and Morphing Jar. So many ways. Painful Choice. So many ways to get light and dark in the graveyard. I immediately caught on to this, built this deck, and completely destroyed the scene, which made everybody change their mind about the Chaos decks. A couple of my close friend group friends would splash a copy of Blackluster Soldier or a copy of Chaos Emperor Dragon into their now Chaos Beatdown decks, but they weren't utilizing the monsters in the same way as the hand control decks, and refused to do such things, except for one of my friends, who ended up also building his own rendition of Chaos Control. I do not quite remember what his list was, as this was about 20 years ago at this point, but I remember this tournament. It came down to him and I as the final 2 players of that tournament. That really solidified in the minds of everyone at the tournament that Chaos was now the deck to beat. Whether it be Chaos Control or Chaos Beatdown, Chaos was the way to go. At the following tournaments, Chaos Control or Chaos Tempo ended up being the most represented deck by a large margin. Before, when it was Hand Control and Mahavelo Beatdown, or just pure versions of Beatdown, split pretty 50-50, it was now almost a 90% representation of the tournament scene, running some variation of Chaos Control, and almost a 100% representation of Chaos in general, if you also include the beatdown strategies, including Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon. Some more aggressive variants even including things such as Chaos Sorcerer for more banishing and more bodies on the field more quickly. The one deck not running any of these Chaos monsters whatsoever was a friend of mine in my friend circle, again, playing his Pure Fiend deck, which was a tempo deck in its own right and had a little bit of hand control built into his Fiend strategy. While the deck didn't place, it didn't fare as badly as one might have expected. However, once all of us did see that Chaos was basically the new face of Yu-Gi-Oh, we all soon realized what a Tier 0 format was and what it entailed. The format quickly became stale. Attendance numbers were dropping as a result. As a matter of fact, most of my friend group stopped attending these tournaments, and it was just myself and the other friend of mine that was running Chaos Control of my close friend group still attending these tournaments. We all hoped that the upcoming set, Ancient Sanctuary, would be able to come out with some cards that would take us out of this Tier 0 format. Unfortunately for us, that was not the case. While there were some good tech cards in Ancient Sanctuary, there really wasn't a whole lot in the way of good new decks released in this set. Tournament turnout numbers would continue to dwindle, and we all knew something had to happen. Before that, though, on August 1st, the Yu-Gi-Oh Pyramid of Light movie released, and some promo cards were released given to moviegoers. My friends and I were all there opening day, and we actually ended up buying multiple tickets, so then that way we could get multiple packs of cards, which worked. And then we ended up giving those tickets to other people, and I think they ended up getting cards, but whatever. And I ended up pulling, my very first one was Wadapon. All of us eventually ended up pulling all 4 cards, and for me, Sorcerer of Dark Magic was an instant include in my new deck. Why is that? As it is a very bricky card, and it's a lot harder to get out than one of the Chaos monsters. It was basically a one-sided Jinzo with a 3200 body, which was bigger than the Chaos monsters, and actually made a huge difference whenever it was able to hit the field. However, it wasn't able to hit the field incredibly often, but I did enjoy running it nonetheless, especially with my Dark Magician and Chaos Sorcerer in the deck to fulfill its needs. Sometime later in the month, however, we did get an announcement for a ban list that would be going into effect on October 1st. This ban list outright banned certain cards, such as Chaos Emperor Dragon and Yatagarasu. We as players rejoiced, but since our tournament store was an official tournament store, we ended up having to play through this until October 1st. Numbers were as low as ever until October 1st, when a resurgence of players started to come back. Chaos was still around at this point, but was not nearly as powerful as it used to be, and was a bit more fair, though it was still a very high representation going forward. I myself adapted by running more copies of Chaos Sorcerer in order to get my Sorcerer of Dark Magic online even easier, so I did not so much mind the changes. However, I did drop the hand control portion of the deck at this point, as the hand control was severely weakened due to the banning of Yatagarasu and of Chaos Emperor Dragon, as well as some of the hand rip cards. There were still ways to make this work, such as the combo with Tsukiyomi, Mask of Darkness, and Time Seal, but it was a lot more clunky and was a lot less consistent to get working. It did work and could essentially Yata-lock someone out of the game. I had seen it work, as people were trying to make hand control continue to work, but, however, it just saw too much of a devastating blow to really be a tier 1 strategy anymore. It is at this point that my deck morphed into what I would call Spellcaster Chaos Tempo, a fusion between Goat Control and Chaos Turbo, utilizing a copy of both Magical Scientist and Metamorphosis for fusion deck plays. In order to more consistently go into my Magical Scientist plays, I did have a little Magician's Apprentice engine running 3 Apprentice Magician to be able to search out and set itself, Magical Scientist, Magician of Faith, or even Old Vindictive Magician. This, coupled with the small Dark Magician engine I was still running, made this deck feel very toolboxy and very reactive to many situations. It also could proactively put me into a position where I could win the game. As for the rest of my play group, the Chaos Control player ended up continuing to play Chaos Control, but obviously without the hand control portion added. He was running 3 copies of Metamorphosis at this time with Scapegoat and Thousand Eyes Restrict to be able to lock down the board and control the board more easily. I was running Thousand Eyes Restrict as well, but not all in on the game plan like he was. Our resident Fiend player was still playing Fiends, and our resident Warrior player was still playing Warriors. Another one of our friends in the friend group who had just recently began playing the game was playing a deck that wasn't too popular at the time, and that deck was Pac-Man. While it did perform with middling results, it did sometimes get you, and it was a ton of fun for them to play. It was their favorite deck, and what drew them into the game, so why not enjoy whatever deck you enjoy? Finally, my other friend that had been toying around with Beatdown and Dragons had also decided to take the road of Fiends alongside my other friend. His build was completely different and featured a more defensive and removal-based strategy. At this point, the rest of the meta at our tournament scene was quite varied. There were Dragon decks, there were Warrior decks, there were Fiend decks, and even hand control decks attempting to make things work with the tools that they still had available to them. And finally, there were various forms of Chaos decks, mine included. There were about 2 players playing what would come to be known as Chaos Turbo, but the rest of the scene that was playing Chaos was playing a new form of Chaos Control, which would be later known as Goat Control, utilizing Chaos just as a control theme, alongside Metamorphosis, and in this case Magical Scientist was also used alongside of Metamorphosis. However, it was clear the hits on this ban list were fundamental to reshaping the metagame in its entirety, but Chaos was still dominating. I wouldn't call this a Tier 0 format at this point, but Chaos was still in a Tier 1 state alongside Warrior Toolbox decks. As the rest of the year progressed, however, some other decks would make their appearance. Water decks would crop up here and there, utilizing a Legendary Ocean and locking people out with Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B, as well as some precursors to what now would be known as Panda Burn decks. Pac-Man was still a one-man show, as well as the newly formed Empty Jar from the one person that had been able to get all of the rare tournament pack cards. They were running Empty Jar, and there were definitely some tournaments where they completely took it, and there were other tournaments where they lost every single match they played. It was a very all-or-nothing strategy. I felt very lucky at this point that no one had really thought about Magical Scientist as a combo piece until the very last week of December, which, of course, at the beginning of December, Rise of Destiny would release, but there really wasn't a whole lot there for a whole new deck to be built. But this was the basis of the upcoming GOAT format. During this final week of tournaments in December, one person brought a new kind of deck that we had only heard of and read about, but had never seen in person. And that was Mad Scientist FTK. Someone, this absolute mad lad, decided to bring it. And he was relatively newer to this scene, but, had just been playing. I don't even remember what they were playing before this because this was just so memorable. Because Magical Scientist performed fairly well in this event. And people were like, holy moly, you can actually do this and win on the first turn? Yes. It wasn't super consistent, and they didn't end up taking the event, but they did place quite well, and they, did get some kind of prizing for it. Most of us at the tournament applauded this young man for being able to pull off a deck like this, while another louder section of the tournament was angry that this deck could exist and, labeled it as bullshit, etc., etc. And of course, it too eventually became banned. But that wasn't going to be for a couple more months. And we didn't know that it was going to be banned at the time. We thought that this was just going to be the meta going forward, that this was just going to be one of the new top decks. On January 1st, though, there was the release of Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness structure decks, which included some easy ways to get some cards that were, not really that hard to get anyway. Though, with the release of Zombie Madness, we did start to see some Chaos Zombie decks crop up at our local meta scene that performed quite well. It is also around this time where the Monarchs started seeing play as tech cards in various decks. Zaborg the Thunder Monarch found itself in various Chaos lists as another form of removal and a decent-sized body. Mobius the Frost Monarch was the premier back row removal and saw play in main decks and sideboards everywhere. And Thestalos Firestorm Monarch was starting to see play in some of the hand control decks that were looking for more answers for hand control options. This did apply some power to hand control lists, and they started to perform a bit better in the tournament scene. Flaming Eternity dropped on March 1st of 2005, which didn't really give us a whole lot, to be completely frank. It did spawn a whole new OTK deck, that being Benkei OTK, coupled alongside something like Mataza the Zapper, to equip a bunch of stuff onto these monsters to get an OTK from 8,000 life points. Some good tech cards were also released in this set, including Lightning Vortex, Threatening Roar, and Phoenix Wing Windblast, just to name a few. Otherwise, this was a very minor set that only had tech cards, though it did spawn a new OTK deck. However, following this release was the ban list in April. April's ban list banned Magical Scientist, so the Magical Scientist deck was now dead, and was no longer a toolbox piece within my deck, due to such. Some other cards on the banned and limited list moved around a little bit, but there wasn't a whole lot of change other than the elimination of Magical Scientist. But now, it was officially GOAT format. Many GOAT control pure lists rose up as a result, without Blackluster Soldier. So Chaos lists and Chaos GOAT control was a thing at our meta. I was still running Chaos Tempo at the time. Not much changed in my ban list, besides some banned and restricted cards getting moved around, and no more Magical Scientist in my list. However, I was still running Metamorphosis, as it was a great way to toolbox into fusion monsters. I was still running the Magician's Apprentice toolbox, just with no longer a Magical Scientist to go into. I was also still running the small Dark Magician engine and Sorcerer of Dark Magic to be able to get out that big trap negating body. Chaos and Chaosless Warrior Toolbox decks also popped up in this era. The usual outliers at our meta still remained, with Water, Fiend hand control, and regular hand control featuring Thestalos, the Thunderstorm Monarch. Remarkably, at the beginning of this format, there were absolutely no Chaos Turbo decks in sight. My deck, which was Chaos Tempo, was the closest thing to a Chaos Turbo deck. It was basically an in-between of Chaos Turbo and Goat Control, which fared exceptionally well within this metagame. I had the tools necessary in the main and sideboard to be able to stop Goat Control quite effectively, and was able to beat over them and get wins the majority of the time. Truthfully, the decks that gave me the hardest time during this time period were water decks and hand control decks, as well as some variants of Warrior Toolbox. One thing that I had failed to mention in the previous ban list announcement was that Ring of Destruction was gone, so my ring barrel notoriety ended here, for the time being anyway. I was now instead well known for not giving up on chaos and still performing well with it in a meta full of Goat Control. It was at this time that many people online thought that the format was solved and ruined because Goat Control was the quote-unquote best deck, and no one wanted to give Chaos a try anymore, as they thought the deck was too weak. As we know now, that is not the case, and Chaos Turbo is the deck to beat in GOAT format, with Chaos Control and Chaos Tempo trying to out-tempo or control the Turbo player. To round out GOAT format, we saw releases in May and June of 2005. Blaze of Destruction and Fury from the Deep structure decks released in May of 2005 and bolstered some fire and water strategies. The one water player did run Ocean Dragon Lord, Neo Daedalus, as well as Daedalus. And one fire deck did pop up at the tournament, which was kind of a burn control kind of deck. It wasn't very good, but when it worked well. Then in June, The Lost Millennium and Tournament Pack 6 released. The Lost Millennium added support for some new upcoming decks, as well as a few tech cards, such as Brain Control. Tournament Pack 6 saw Toon Cannon Soldier and Toon Table of Contents released, which wouldn't really be all that important now, but would be important for several OTK decks in the near future. Not too many changes in the meta, other than the addition of a fire deck to our one water deck that was also being ran and upgraded for this format. The deck to beat in this format was still Goat Control, and was the most popular at our tournament scene. Chaos did see representation at our local scene, with my Chaos Tempo deck, my friend's Chaos Control deck, and my other friend's Chaos Warrior deck. Another one of my friends playing the Warrior Toolbox without Chaos, as he has been this pretty much entire time. Then we had the hand control player and my friend who was playing Fiend hand control, still actually fared quite well in this meta. A Pac-Man deck that has been around since they started playing Pac-Man, Empty Jar, and finally, another new deck, Benki Vilo Zapper. This was less of a combo OTK deck like traditional Benki OTK, but was more of an aggressive build, running Mahavelos, Benki, Mataza the Zapper, and sometimes Hayabusa Knight, alongside a suite of equip cards that could be searched for with 2 or 3 copies of Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu. This deck could have some blowout victories, and ultimately I prefer this deck over Benki OTK. I think that this deck has a bit more thought process to it, and it's actually a bit more resilient, as it did place fairly well in some of these events. Overall, at this time, we had a diverse and robust metagame at our local tournament scene that had many decks, and many different decks would see topping placements as well as first place. I was able to get some first places. Some of the hand control players got first place. And of course, some goat control players also went away with first place. And even Benki Vilo Zapper would take first place a time or two. Water and Fire would see top cut, but would never see any first place finishes during this time period. Empty Jar was able to secure one first place finish within this meta. Every iteration of Warriors were able to put up a single first place finish, but Pac-Man and Fiend hand control did struggle in this meta. However, this was quite the robust and diverse metagame, and it made playing the game a lot of fun during this era. This is one of my favorite eras to look back on and even to continue to play, as there is a robust GOAT format scene. I have a ton of different decks for GOAT format, so if you want to see any of those decks or deck techs of those decks, let me know down in the comment section and I'll provide those to you. But this is the end of the series for now. This is part 1, the Duel Monsters era of my history with Yu-Gi-Oh! Because soon, a cybernetic revolution is going to take over. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's story video. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe, and ding that bell. Also, why not check out my Patreon? If you liked this video, let me know down in the comments section below so that I can expedite the next part of the series. Thank you all so much once again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. This is DMFF signing out. Take care.